Have you ever wondered why it seems like everyone has a grandmother named Grace, who is their favorite, who makes snickerdoodles and lets them eat ice cream on the couch? Well, snickerdoodles or not, while I might not actually know your grandmother, I might have an idea of where she got her name. You see, in the lineage of subtle Christian-adjacent names like Prudence, Faith, and Chastity, Grace is not the worst noun to be named after. But what actually is grace? And what does it mean?
Grace!
And more specifically, what is the Wesleyan concept of grace? Because as United Methodists, we have a bit of a bias towards that one. Now, first of all, grace is not something that you can hold. It's not a physical thing that you can hold and carry with you. Instead, I'd invite you to reconceptualize grace as a pattern of actions that bring you closer to God's vision for your life. For instance, when you take all of your advice from 90s bumper stickers and ask yourself, what would Jesus do? That is following a path of grace. This guy, John Wesley, the father of Methodism, kind of a big deal in any Wesleyan tradition, liked to describe grace in 3 parts: prevenient, justifying, and sanctifying grace, all of which are simpler than the names make them seem. Prevenient grace, or preventing grace, is with you before you even know what grace is or who God is at all. So perhaps the term prevenient grace does make a little sense, as it comes from a Latin origin, a word meaning to prepare, which is to say, this is the grace we receive in order to recognize God's call and respond to it in our own time. This grace prepares us. Prevenient grace is most easily acknowledged in hindsight. When we experience transformation, we can see how God was at work in our lives long before we ever realized it. This is prevenient grace. Now, justifying grace is the grace that is talked about most commonly in conjunction with sin. You know, the big bad wolf of religion. Justifying grace is the grace we receive when we seek forgiveness for our shortcomings and our mistakes. Because no one is perfect, and it is not expected that we are.
Nobody's perfect?
It is called justifying grace because it is the grace that justifies us. It reconciles us to God. Justifying grace is the grace that carries us over the chasm that sin has created between us and the divine, so that we can have full relationship with God. Sanctifying grace is maybe the most complicated because it requires the most action on our part. This is the transforming grace that allows us to live fully into the glory of God. To sanctify means to make holy. So sanctifying grace is what makes our lives holy, which is hopefully what we're all aiming for. We do this by following a path that's built on loving God and loving neighbor. This grace, sanctifying grace, works on us throughout our life of faith. It is always available to us as we make our journey towards Christian perfection, a topic that definitely calls for its own video. So, for an example of each type of grace in one's lifetime, consider the fictional journey of old Jedidiah, the reformed cat burglar. Little Jed was not raised in a good old Methodist church community, so he didn't grow up learning fancy religious terms like prevenient grace. But that doesn't mean that God wasn't at work in little Jed's life. Grace is available to everyone, whether or not they realize that that's what it is. At some point, Jedidiah was forced into a life of crime due to some terribly tragic but inevitable circumstances that could fill an enthralling 6 seasons and a movie.
6 seasons and a movie!
But eventually, he decided to leave that portion of his life behind. Whatever it was that empowered him to make that decision, that is justifying grace. From this moment on, Jedidiah dedicated his life to volunteering in his community, advocating for those facing oppression, and even regularly praying on his own. Jedidiah, the recently repentant cat burglar, fostered a relationship with God and asked for forgiveness for all the harm he had caused in his life of burgling. Through these acts of sanctifying grace, Jedidiah, the reformed cat burglar, made his life holy and lived the rest of his life constantly improving into the person or cat that God had always known he could be. Okay, yes, that example was very silly and extreme. But that's the basic gist of how the 3 types of grace can impact one's faith journey. To round out this video, I do want to briefly mention the different types of ways that we can live out sanctifying grace in our own lives. John Wesley called these our means of grace, which we receive through 1, acts of worship, like going to church or receiving communion; 2, acts of devotion, like private prayer or reading the Bible; 3, acts of justice, like fighting racism, poverty, transphobia, and other systems of inequality; and 4, acts of compassion, like tending to the sick and feeding the hungry. It's exactly what it sounds like. So go forth, wherever you are on your faith journey, know that there is a grace for you, and there will always be another one when you are ready to take the next step. Through these acts of sanctifying grace, Jedidiah, the reformed cat burglar, okay.